point, we have a basic schema for the JSON response that we are testing. We expect the response to have 4 properties: user ID, title, and completed. And we've also specified the types of each of these properties. Now let me add a new property here, a property blah of type Boolean. Now if I were to run my test and validate the response from the API against my validation schema, you can see that the test passes. This is because by default, the schema validator considers all properties to be optional. Blah is considered to be an optional property, so if it's not present in the response, that's totally fine. That won't be a validation error. But if the property is present, it should be a Boolean property. However, we can have additional properties here if there are optional properties. Now, let me specify certain properties to be required. This is an additional field at the top level of the JSON called required, and it specifies an array of values. The array of values is basically just a list of property names. Here I've said that user ID, title, and completed are required properties in the JSON response. This means that if any of these properties are not present in the JSON response, that will be considered to be a validation error. We know that all 4 properties are indeed present in the response, and we run this test and you can see the test passes. But what if I specified blah as a required property as well? We know that the blah property is defined as a property with type Boolean, but it's not really present in the response. But now I've gone ahead and marked it as a required property. What do you think will happen when the test runs? Well, you guessed right. The test will fail. I have indicated that blah should be present in the JSON response, but it wasn't. You can see the error here and the details are very clear. Object has missing required properties, blah. And then a little bit below, you can see the required properties are blah, completed ID, title, and user ID. And what's missing is blah. It's very, very clear where the failure occurred. And if you scroll down a bit, you can actually see what response was returned. This is always available. It'll show you what JSON response was returned, so you can use that to verify whether the response is right or wrong. I'll just get rid of blah from the list of required properties here, and I'll get rid of its property definition as well on lines 20 through 22. Now that we've understood how required properties work, that is, properties are optional unless they are marked required, let's make another change to our schema here and see what the effect is. I'm going to get rid of this property completed altogether. I'll get rid of its specification in the properties object, and I'll also get rid of it from the list of required fields. So we know that completed is present as a property in the response, but it's not part of our JSON schema. If you were to run the validation test on the response now, you'll find that the test passes. And the reason for that is, by default, if there are additional properties in the response that you haven't specified as a part of your schema validation, those are ignored unless you mark them as a required property. And this behavior makes sense if you think about it. Imagine that you're testing an API in the real world. The API developers are going to be changing their response formats, and they may be adding new additional information to the JSON responses that the endpoints return. Now, let's say you have a set of tests for a set of endpoints. Each time one of the endpoints adds a new JSON property to its response, you don't want your test to fail. And this is why by default, additional properties are allowed by default in the response. And this is controlled by a field called additional properties. I've added the additional properties field here on line 23 and I've set it to true, but that is its default value. When additional properties is set to true, this means that the JSON response can have new properties that you haven't validated as a part of your schema validation. If you were to run this test, it behaves the same way as before because additional properties is true by default. Now, it's always possible that you want your schema validation to be very, very strict. You don't want the developers to be introducing additional properties when you're not expecting them. In that case, set the additional properties field value in your schema to be equal to false. This will make your schema validation more strict. If the JSON response that is returned has properties other than the ones that you're expecting, well, that will result in a schema validation error, as we shall see. Let's go ahead and run this and notice we get a validation error because the response contains the completed property and we had set additional properties to false. So object instance has properties which are not allowed by the schema, and that is the completed properties. A little bit below, you can see that there is an unwanted property in the response, completed. Let's go and specify that completed is indeed a property that we expect. add completed to the properties object, and make sure it's part of the required array as well. Now with additional properties set to false, when we run the schema validation, everything should pass.